Um, Thank you for joining. This is an online recorded session as well, so it's really great to have the opportunity to discuss today Climate and Nature Nexus, Adaptation Risk and Resilience. My name is Chris Percival. I'm Senior Market Engagement Director with S&P Global Sustainable One. And joined with me today, we have Freedom Kai Phillips, who is the Director of the Center for Sustainable Progress at Deloitte. We have Rowan Douglas, who's the CEO of Risk and Resilience at Howden Group. And we have Ujjwala Kadir, who's Director of Strategy and Programs with the Climate Bonds Initiative. So it's a really fantastic panel to unpack this exciting and actually quite cutting-edge topic, because it's early and it's no doubt definitely going to grow. So in terms of the run of show, we're going to have a 5-minute intervention from each of the panelists, and then we'll open it up to Q&A with the audience, and we'll finish by looking ahead at what we're expecting next, both at COP but also in the market as this evolves and grows. So I'm going to kick off with sharing a little bit of scene setting from an S&P Global perspective. I'm going to share with you 3 pieces of recent research and methodology that we've developed. So the first is in terms of where we are, right? So in terms of essentially, in terms of a stock take, there are multiple different ways that you can look at this. But just very recently published is our assessment of 2,800 of the largest companies that have set net zero commitments. And when analysed over the last 5 years, what progress is being made. And the findings are that there is a 1% per annum increase of emissions over scopes 1, 2 and 3, relative or versus the 6.4% per annum reduction which is required. So it won't be any surprise for you to know that we are heading towards a slow transition scenario. Now, when we look at the slow transition scenario, our S&P Global Ratings colleagues have done analysis in terms of what does that mean in terms of economic consequences. And on average, and there is quite substantial variability across countries, a 4.4% of GDP loss annually is what is forecast, absent adaptation. So from the climate hazards that have been analysed within that work by S&P Global Ratings, 60% of the potential economic losses are caused by water stress and extreme heat. Most of the exposure is in lower income countries and in South Asia. So that's stock take where we are. A bit more about adaptation, the need for adaptation, the economic consequences without it. And then in terms of nature, because that's really the purpose of this panel, is to unpack the nexus of climate and nature. So what role will and can nature play in the story as it unfolds going forwards in terms of adaptation, resilience and risk? And I think that there are 2 different levels at which we'll see that manifest. But importantly, the entry point, and I think that Freedom Kai is going to expand on this a little bit, is to think about the nature risk profile of both companies and countries. And importantly, ecosystem services, so things like water, regulating services, provisioning services, storm protection, those types of things are going to be increasingly important to value and reflect in the market instruments that help to build the adaptation marketplace. So with that framing, I'd like to turn to each of the panelists to ask them to introduce themselves and their organizations a little bit, but also on this topic of climate and nature nexus, adaptation and risk, what their particular position and view is on it. So first I'll turn to Freedom Kai.
Thank you, Chris. Great pleasure to be able to join everyone today. As the director of the Deloitte Center for Sustainable Progress, we're trying to advance Paris-aligned, data-driven approaches and harmonizing the view on research across the climate and nature nexus across the global firms. A really great introduction that you've been able to set. There's such a wide range of intersections that organizations and governments need to understand and strategically address to be able to take into account what these impacts and dependencies are on nature as it sits at that real nexus across the spectrum. So first, what we're finding is organizations are working diligently to be able to measure and understand what that impact and dependencies look like, right? So these are organizations that have very complex value chains, for instance. Think of maybe a food producer like Danone or Mars. These are sourcing from upwards of 80 different countries. Some of the most complex, some of the most challenging raw materials that you might be thinking of, cocoa, palm oil. These have large impacts on the natural environment. Being able to ask an organization to be able to measure what their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions are is a first stage. But then once they've been able to understand what that footprint looks like, then moving into the more complex picture of what that impact and dependency across their nature value chain is an entirely different evolutionary process for most organizations. They're just coming to grips with what their climate impact is. So being able to understand what tools they can use to be able to measure this, how they are putting in place a strategy, what are the particular metrics that they're looking to ramp up or address, these are very, very complex to be able to both communicate but then operationalize internally. There's some very good tools that many organizations are using, however. So we are leading a project with the World Economic Forum right now on the valuation of Earth observation data. This is both satellite as well as in situ data. So these are things like sensors. When you take into account this whole picture, you can start to curate for organizations, leveraging various other elements like generative AI to help give them actionable insights on what is this impact or dependency, where can they have a material impact, and project what those particular mitigation actions look like in concert over time. Right? So you can start to get a sense of what those levers are that organizations are able to manipulate or able to influence so that they can start to get a better handle on what this picture is and start to project where they are now and where they want to go. It's very difficult, though, when we start to think about what this looks like in an ever-changing environment. Right? The yields of organizations right now, the dependence on particular regions for raw materials, the ability to be able to predict this post-2035 is becoming increasingly convoluted. Organizations need to have a better understanding, as you said, Chris, on the intersections and the necessity of maintaining these ecosystem services. These are valuable elements that most organizations either undervalue or don't appropriately understand. Now, I think it's helpful that S&P, along with UNEP WCMC, have put forward a methodology for organizations to start to internalize what that valuation framework looks like, but being able to unpack their portfolio and what some of their holdings are, and the impact of what this climate evolution is on that portfolio is one element. Being able to integrate where their strategic goals might be as it relates to the valuation or positive incentivization of these ecosystem services is a second. So I'll use the example of Project Oceanum, which Danone helped invest in. In the early 2000s, Danone wanted to take a more systematic approach to the conservation of nature and the intersection with climate-related goals and livelihoods. So they invested in what has now become the Livelihood Ventures. It's a collection of funds, started with just one. They were informed by IUCN and the Ramsar Convention, so it was grounded in international expertise and institutions. They made investments in very specific projects that had a connection at that nature-climate nexus with livelihoods and ideally indigenous peoples and local communities. With the good example that I like to use is Project Oceanum. So this is a reforestation in Senegal of a mangrove. Now this is 10,000 hectares that have been restored. That's equivalent to the size of Paris. They brought together over 350 indigenous communities. They empowered the community, so you have intergenerational engagement and learning. You then have a 20-year life cycle where you're generating gold standard carbon credits. So now you have both technical expertise, capacity building going into the communities. You have alternative livelihoods that have now been generated. And then when you look back and they do a project assessment after 10 years, over 85% of the communities that were engaged highlighted massive increases, 4x on livelihoods. So they 4x household income. Increased storm surge protection, like you noted, increased access to food resources, marine resources. Not only are you being able to create alternative revenue generation, alternative livelihoods, but you're empowering the community to more effectively understand and apply their traditional knowledge to this ecosystem conservation, and at the same time bringing a consortium of organizations together who are now benefiting from what these gold standard credits are able to be utilized for. That is just one example, and it cuts across a range of these aspects, but organizations that are actively engaging in this space are working to understand what that looks like, are leveraging these new innovative technologies so that they can have a better view on what their impacts are and what these changes of ecological character look like, and are starting to systematically engage with what this risk is in the current and near term, and starting to put a forward-looking strategy on how they can engage this in the longer term.
Wow, Freedom Kai, that is an incredible example, actually. Thank you for sharing that, and with detail that really helped us to understand the importance of people, the role of business, and actually how an instrument can bring together the different partners in an effective and potentially scalable way. Rowan, in terms of instruments, I mean, you've been involved in some really important work recently. I hope that you'll share with us more about that, but also about the work that you're doing at Howden Group.
Sure. Thanks so much, Chris. Yes, I work for Howden Group, which is an insurance and reinsurance broker, and also chair something called the Insurance Development Forum's Operating Committee. And I'm going to set myself a mission in the next 4.5 minutes. My mission is to, if not convince you, make you all seriously curious that insurance and insurance thinking isn't just relevant to retraining the invisible hand to value nature, but it actually might be quite essential to do that. And I will try and give one or two examples too. I think we all know the challenge with nature. I mean, it sounds like this is probably a puree of wisdom in the audience on this matter to be here. Challenge is often it doesn't have an income stream, and often no one really owns it. And that doesn't often make it really easy to account for it and to make, obviously, a business case for engagement with it. But, you know, insurance is a funny thing. Insurance has two attributes which are hidden. The first is that it doesn't value things by the asset side of the balance sheet. What it says is what is an organization, and that could be a country, it could be a city, or it could be a company. It says, what are your contingent liabilities? What are the things that could happen to you? And it requires people to account for that. And so insurance companies spend all their time simulating tens of thousands of potential years of activity to very accurately say on their balance sheets what could happen. And in a world, and Freedom Kai, you sort of touched on this, in a world where organizations, cities will have to disclose all sorts of risks, including their dependencies on nature, it's through that mechanism that essentially we value nature, by valuing what impact it would have through its diminution or collapse of service, and what impact that would have on your revenues. What are the probabilities of that this year and next year? And that allows us to calculate a contingent liability. And in a world where we will have to disclose our risks, those contingent liabilities will have to be accounted for. And that, frankly, once nature risk becomes an input to credit risk or to regulatory capital in a bank, everything changes. And what that means is that anything we do to strengthen the sustainability of those natural assets reduces your risk. And as soon as that happens, actually it affects your balance sheet. You don't own that forest, you don't own that river. And that's a magic piece of retraining the invisible hand that is underway. Frankly, it's not happening quick enough. But ironically, the insurance sector is the sector that has the gearbox to do that. And funnily enough, parts of the credit rating agency community that cover insurance have that in their gearbox. And we've got to speed that up. But the second thing is even more interesting. The second thing is you don't need to own an asset to insure it. You just need to have an insurable interest in an asset. And that's really important, and it's really unique, and it's really special. So what that means is insurance isn't an industry. It is an institution of society. It operates in the public sector, the private sector. What it basically says is communities, be they global or local, decide what it is they value, what it is they need to protect, and what are the behaviors they need to do to ensure the security of that asset, whatever it might be. It could be your children, it could be your community, it could be your forest. Let's talk about a coral reef. I've been lucky enough to be involved in the insurance of more coral reefs than anyone else. So I was involved in a project in a previous organization. I've just joined my new one. So the Mesoamerican Reef, the second largest reef in the world off the east coast of Central America. It has enormous roles, and there are enormous dependencies on that reef. Obviously, the people who fish on it, the people who live on it, the people who are protected from the storm surge, we mentioned that earlier, the attraction for the tourism industry. And actually, that reef is at risk. We can actually calculate the risk that reef has every year and the impact on communities and business and the public sector. So what happened was, with the help of, and the role of philanthropy to initiate some of this stuff is so key, the Nature Conservancy, with a group called the Mesoamerican Reef Fund, created a trust which many stakeholders who had a stake in that reef, hotels, local authorities, others, could formally support that reef to manage the reef, and then actually, through that entity, buy an insurance policy, which was triggered by what's called parametric insurance, to ensure that if an event occurs, the reef can be, to some degree, repaired through a variety of interventions. And I've learned more about coral reef restoration the last year. Ironically, at the last COP in Sharm, a hurricane did come through. It paid out. And at that point, the teams went out and started rebuilding the reef. Now, it's not as big as it needs to be, but it's getting better. The principle is there. And we can do this about anything. If you are buying up forests for carbon credits, but you need to make sure that those carbon credits will be still valuable in 10 years' time, you can now insure the political risks that may be within the domain of that credit. You can insure against extreme events which might destroy that. So insurance is going to become a form of governance. And the challenge is that we're not very good at getting involved, because we tend to look at our shoes and we don't really sort of engage in the mainstream of finance. But we have to. And it's through climate that I hope we can. So I'll stop there, Chris. But it's been such a privilege to be invited today. And we're making this COP the insurance breakthrough. So please help us.
That is fantastic. Thank you very much for sharing that. I love many of the points, but particularly about the insurable interest and the invisible hand. And we may come back to you perhaps during the Q&A. We have some senior representatives from rainforest nations, Panama, Paraguay, and others. So we'll come to you hopefully for your interventions and thoughts. We heard about the rainforests of the seas. We can also talk about the terrestrial rainforests as well. So in terms of debt capital markets, Ujala. I think that about 2/3 of the financing of adaptation currently is through debt finance. I know that the work that you're doing at Climate Bonds Initiative is going to be expanding this area. Yesterday we were just chatting together about both adaptive but also enabling conditions. Could you share with us a little bit more about the work that you're doing, but also perhaps unpack those two areas as well? Thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. So I'm Ujala from the Climate Bonds Initiative. The Climate Bonds Initiative is a non-for-profit that's focused on mobilizing debt capital markets for climate solutions. So before I start answering that question, I just want to share with you a bit about me and my personal story, just really quickly, because I think it helps. I started off working in the development sector, and I come from an engineering background. And I used to work in really remote rural communities in northern Pakistan and saw just constant disasters. And we would be building infrastructure, that infrastructure would get destroyed. But one trip that I had up to the north, it was pretty devastating because this community was just dreadfully impacted. And across the way was another community that was not as impacted. And of course, I started asking, why is that? And it was because they hadn't deforested the lands around where they were living, and the landsliding was just not as damaging. So the connection between nature and adaptation became very, very clear to me. And then I went back to university and studied climate adaptation and science. So just wanted to share that a bit with you, and that kind of leads me to what I'm working on now, what Climate Bonds is working on now, which is looking at adaptation and resilience and looking at nature and the impacts of climate on nature. So looking at the impacts of different hazards as well. So at Climate Bonds, we work on definitions and standards to try to support this market, to grow debt capital markets, because we feel that definitions really help make it clear to issuers and to investors what can credibly be included into a bond structure. So I want to share one piece of good news. It's not the best news, but I think it's good news, which is that there already is some financing happening through the debt capital and bond markets. Not a lot. And it's happening through existing instruments, not new instruments, not like resilience bonds, but actually green bonds. And green bonds are a very large asset class. It's 3.2 trillion that's been issued of green bonds, and 4 trillion of actually social and sustainability and green bonds together. So out of that, again, adaptation is a very small percentage. It's about 18%, and nature is an even smaller percentage. But I still want to look at the good news, which is that it's there, which means we can scale up, which means there's a path to scaling up. So some of the examples that we've seen in the market of where we've seen it the most is in the municipal bond sector. So especially in the US, we've seen water utilities, I think, is where we've seen the most action in terms of nature, and it's mostly been through green infrastructure. So for example, I have some statistics here. I won't go too deep in the statistics, but there was the Central Arkansas Water Utility. They serve about 500,000 people in the US. This municipality issued a $31 million bond, and 30% of that bond was used to purchase 1,800 hectares of forest land, just to protect the land. Because that actually saves money in terms of filtration, water quality, water security. So it made sense for this municipality to actually conserve land. And yeah, so I think that's a great example. Another example that I wanted to share really briefly is a blue bond that was issued by the Seychelles government. And it was very pioneering. It's a relatively small bond, but it's very unique because it was dedicated to support the expansion of marine protected areas. It also supports a line of credit and a loan facility for blue economy related activities. So it builds livelihoods and resilience through that. And I mean, to make this a reality, the World Bank provided some blending, some risk guarantees, there was some concessional finance involved. So sometimes these are not straightforward structures, and they do require some sort of public-private partnership in terms of bringing finance together to make it work. And sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes there's a really clear business case, like in the municipalities or in other cases. So I think we need to find more examples like this, learn from them, and really help to scale that up. Now, to your question on enabling and system, I'm glad you asked that because I hadn't put it in my notes, and I do want to talk about that because what these two terms that we use at Climate Bonds, enabling versus asset level adaptation, basically is trying to expand what our conception of adaptation is. Traditionally, adaptation is about adapting an existing asset to risks of climate change, like strengthening and hardening infrastructure. And that's generally what I think people think about. But resilience and adaptation needs to happen across the economy, across all the different sectors. So enabling is like when we invest in building health facilities in drought-prone areas or malaria-prone areas. That's also a resilience investment, but it hasn't really traditionally been included in resilience-focused bonds or in resilience instruments. It's generally more that hardening aspect. So I think it's really important for us to take a more integrated approach, because we're trying to solve for multiple problems at the same time. And if we don't look at instruments that can do that, then we're missing a trick. So green, nature, adaptation, we need to look at these holistically. Of course, while still being realistic, we can't expect every bond to cover every type of instrument. So what we're trying to do with the climate bonds taxonomy is provide guidance on, if you are going to focus on nature or on adaptation, here's the minimum requirements you still need to meet in order to be green. But you know, it really enables a more detailed focus or a dedicated instrument to adaptation to nature. So that's the work we're doing on the taxonomy. Yeah, I think I'll stop there and pass back.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much. And I'm sure that the mic will come back to you in a moment. We're going to take some questions or comments. And actually, I'd like to also ask if anyone can also reflect on, I think a really important point that's come out of the discussion so far is that adaptation, nature plays a role both at a local level and at a systemic level. And there are ways of analyzing and thinking about, but also building interventions accordingly. So, Kimberly.
So thank you all today. It's an excellent conversation. It is so relevant. So when we think about the business case for nature and the importance of mobilizing capital, and it was fabulous to hear the variety of raising that capital, because nature doesn't have that revenue stream, as pointed out. And there's bonds, there is insurance as contingent liabilities on the balance sheet. So these are all novel ideas, and I'm glad there's like examples. So one of our panels earlier yesterday, we had the vice chair of ISSB, and they're prioritizing nature to make it where it is accountable and there is data and transparency to de-risk and really mobilize capital into nature. And so from your perspective, when you think of ISSB or these regulatory frameworks, that it's more at the systematic level, as you mentioned, Chris, but the real work happens at the local level, right? And it's bringing these public-private partnerships together. It's really activating more community-led efforts. But I guess I threw out a lot of those different concepts that really are the basis of, we need to create kind of ISSB is what I've heard is really that platform to try to bring in that kind of data, transparency, and accountability. But I really want to hear your perspectives as experts, so thank you.
Great. Look, let's take one or two more questions and then we can all respond. So, please.
I have an insurance question, because I'm sure the insurance guy never gets asked anything. I'd like to understand how you would, how your program would impact the coalition, because what they're really trying to do is put together these sovereign Red Plus credits, and who purchases the insurance? Is it the sovereign nation? Is it the purchaser of the credits? How would you sort of structure that for the rainforest nations? Does that make sense at all? Okay. Well, it's okay. This is a chance for your sales pitch.
Okay, I'm just looking to see if there was anyone wanting to sort of build on one of the two questions already made. They could. Let's maybe start with the insurance question.
Certainly, ISSB and financial regulation generally, as well as accounting and credit rating, is essential. That is what will retrain the invisible hand. And it's wonderful that the regulators are sort of, and this has been developing, maybe not quite so much for nature, but certainly for climate, for almost 10 years actually. Mark Carney began the journey in London in 2013. So they've sort of set the course. What we don't actually have is the agreed methodology and metrics, as well as models, that will be tractable at a macro as well as a local. They're coming, and actually there's quite an exciting convergence, dare I say it, coalition of the right sort of modelling organisations, both academic, sort of public as well as private, coming together in something called the Resilient Planet Data Hub, which is very plugged into the financial regulatory community to try and basically square that circle. I must say, from a theoretical point of view, they will use the basic methodology that reinsurance had to develop, which is essentially the marriage of actuarial science, engineering metrics, as well as human and physical geography. It's that incredible blend of expertise that allowed our industry to go from ruin to resilience. So, that data will be essential to answer this gentleman's question. Unfortunately, I don't know enough about Red Plus to give you a detailed answer, but I'm going to try and make a link between one thing I do know about and this. So I was lucky enough to be involved in this report from Cambridge, actually, Cambridge University, that came out last week, and it was looking at the role of risk capital markets, things like reinsurance and catastrophe bonds, to amplify the scope and scale of the loss and damage funds. And broadly speaking, what it says, and the example it really focused on in detail, were 30 small island developing states, but the principles apply more generally, that for every dollar of premium that could be provided, these small island developing states could be protected by $75 of risk capital. So, to cut to the chase of the story, these 30 islands, 29 plus Bhutan, they can all lose more than 100% of their GDP, or most of them can, with an extreme event now, drought in the Pacific, or cyclone, hurricane in the Caribbean, as well as storm surge. And it will grow by about 10 or 15% through climate change by 2050. So hold that figure. They could lose more than 100%. And we said, what would it cost in the market to reduce any country from losing more than 10% of their GDP? And it was $1 billion a year. Would unlock 75 billion of capacity. The numbers are quite startling, actually. So I think Barbados would pay about 85 million a year and would receive almost 7 billion of contingent capital. So that meant when an event happens, that money comes, and the premium's been paid by donor governments primarily. But the critical thing is, and it's contractual, it's an entitlement. As soon as the hurricane of a certain intensity goes over defined tracks, the money is essentially there. It's an entitlement. It comes usually within about 2 weeks. And the key thing is, what do you then do with that money? And that's all hypothecated. It can be to sovereign debt rating, it can be to pay for ecosystem restoration. Now, my feeling is, and this is going to happen in some shape or form, and actually when we're ensuring the rainforest of your member states, yes, it's protecting your countries, it's protecting the world. So it's quite right that we all pay the premium. And as I said, when you take out insurance, you usually then have a set of governance requirements. So my feeling is that the loss and the scale of the loss and damage fund, I don't think necessarily it will get to 100 billion a year particularly quickly, but we did then do some analysis, and we think there's about 100 countries which will be loss and damage recipient possible. LDCs, V20 SIDS, plus SIDS. And if each of them were given 10 million of pure premium a year, on average, it does vary depending on the country and the risk, they would gain about $250 million of coverage. Now, we could do all sorts of things with that, and it's a contingent asset. Remember I talked about contingent? You have that money. It's an asset that is contingent on a certain event happening. Now, I would love to see how we can marry this work and what's happening with loss and damage, which I know a little bit about, with your world, which I don't know enough about. But I think there could be, and I think there would be great excitement, because if people see that by contributing loss and damage funds into premium, not only are we insuring those countries, but we're insuring the system upon which we all depend, very explicitly. And everyone we've spoken to about this report, when we talk about proceeds being also available for ecosystems and nature, everyone gets excited. Yes, of course, we talk about humanitarian interventions and rebuilding hospitals, and they should be excited about that, and they are, but I would say what really floats people's boat is nature. So there we go. I hope that's a good start. But let's carry on the conversation. And here, sir, is a copy, not quite my last, of the report. There we go. Thank you so much.
Maybe I'll jump in next on the kind of IISB regulatory questions. I will first congratulate you on citing my alma mater, University of Cambridge, because I did my doctorate work there, so I appreciate land economy and international law. So I appreciate references to. I really should. I'll take the autograph as well. But I think to your point on the role of international standards, that gives us a bit of a step back to take a look at what the role of the international architecture is as a whole, right? Sitting here in a party-driven process at COP28, we have an ongoing negotiation with a range of climate nexus nature intersections. The negotiations around Article 6, the adoption of a common methodology for the incorporation of REDD+ into the SDM is one aspect. The IISB standard, being able to provide a harmonized approach for organizations to understand and report on these methodologies. The intersections of the UNFCCC and other international institutions and architectures. The Ramsar Convention for wetlands of international importance. The CBD for biodiversity. These targets that are set, be that the 30 by 2030, the Montreal Kunming Declaration, be that the other intersections with a range of marine protected areas, the international negotiated instruments are then what are translated into that domestic legal architecture. So you cited the ever enjoyable Seychelles Blue Bond example. How is that actually made possible was the fact that they leveraged their pre-existing international commitments and the pre-existing domestic legal architecture. So this speaks to the necessity for capacity building. This speaks to the necessity for cogent and consistent ratcheting up of ambition, not in a single fora, but across fora, a harmonization of what your goals are, so an articulation within your NDC of what your climate nature pledges are, and then being able to draw that golden thread across the relevant instruments so that you're able to effectively evolve what that NDC is, and then being able to leverage those reporting mechanisms and the translation of that into an effective domestic legal architecture. And you have to keep in mind that we operate with a range, 2/3 likely, fairly to say, in a capacity-constrained environment, right? What is equally a department in, let's say, the Canadian Foreign Service is 1/4 of one person's job in Mali. So being able to understand what that divergent worldview is and being able to ramp up or buttress those governments so that they can effectively translate those international legal norms into their domestic legal architecture gives them the gateway to be able to leverage those platforms for concessionary capital. Our recent findings on financing the green transition have shown the very important role of concessionary finance, in many ways saving us 25% of the overall cost of transition. But that needs to be deployed in the appropriate environment, needs to be calibrated to local needs, and needs to carry with it the capacity building that's necessary to actualize those goals in a real-world setting.
Thank you.
Brilliant. I don't know how to follow those two answers to that question, but I think I'll add one additional point, which is around more of the voluntary standards and the voluntary part of this market. So currently, there, I believe, are more than 30 countries that are developing or have developed sustainable finance taxonomies. And these taxonomies are often used, well, we hope that some of them will actually inform regulation, but many of them are voluntary at this point. But they really help guide capital to the right types of investments. Now, most of these taxonomies are green taxonomies, and they don't have adaptation and resilience, they don't have nature. So we're missing a huge opportunity. And, you know, I'm kind of obsessed with this. It's like, we don't want to try to retrofit the taxonomies. We want to get in now while they're being developed to ensure that they include these different objectives and include them in a way that's really usable by the market, because I think it can have a very catalytic effect. So the EU and China were really the first to kind of come out with their taxonomies, and like I said, it's just been proliferating. There's many coming out in the LAC region, in the Latin American region, also India and Africa. There's many. So yeah, I just wanted to make that point as well, that there's an opportunity to start supporting integration of nature into these taxonomies as well.
Excellent, thank you very much. And you wouldn't believe it, but we're already at time, I'm afraid. So that was a fantastic discussion. 45 minutes. Thanks for your interaction and participation from the audience. Just very last point, in terms of where we are in the negotiations. Actually, right now, my understanding is the coalition of rainforest nations are at the table negotiating around adaptation right now. A couple of the developments in the last few days has included a collaboration among the multilateral development banks to develop what is called, I don't know what the acronym is going to be for this, but it's a task force on sustainability-linked sovereign finance for nature and climate. And I do think that the role of the MDBs is going to become much more important. And I think you'll see probably many of the ideas that came out from here in terms of debt, insurance, interlinkages, and financeability through partnership come through with that work, but a lot more as well. So thanks again for your participation. Thank you very much to the wonderful panelists, and have a good rest of the conference. Bye-bye.